The tears were supposed to end the conversation, but instead they started a reckoning no one saw coming, because the moment Prince Harry's voice cracked in that courtroom, the world was meant to stop asking questions. Pain was supposed to be the proof, emotion was supposed to be the evidence, and for a few breathless hours it worked. Headlines froze, sympathy flooded in, doubt became taboo. But behind that performance, and yes, performance, there was another story moving in silence, a story that didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't beg to be believed, it just waited. And the woman holding the receipts for that story wasn't a journalist, wasn't a tabloid, wasn't a media executive, it was Chelsy D. Let's rewind, not to the courtroom drama, not to the viral clips, but to the part everyone skipped over. Because the first thing that should make you uneasy about this case isn't Harry's emotion, it's the timing. When a man tells a judge that the press destroyed his life, when he does it with red eyes and a trembling voice, our instincts betray us. We stop interrogating, we stop probing, we stop thinking. Emotion hijacks logic. But courts don't run on feelings, and journalism, real journalism, never mistakes tears for truth. Harry walked into that London courtroom framing himself not just as a victim, but as a moral crusader, a man finally standing up to a predatory media machine. He told the judge the press invaded his privacy, stalked his every move, and turned his wife's life into, in his words, an absolute misery. And if you only watched the clipped highlights online, it sounded airtight. A traumatized prince versus a ruthless press, good versus evil. End of story. Except, it wasn't. Because while Harry was publicly blaming tabloids, there were private conversations telling a very different story. Conversations that never made it into the witness box. Conversations that weren't meant for headlines or sympathy. Conversations that happened in real time when the leaks first appeared, before lawyers, before strategy, before narrative control kicked in. And those conversations didn't point to journalists, they pointed inward. Here's where the case starts to crack. Harry's lawsuit accuses Associated Newspapers and the company behind the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday of illegally gathering private information, phone hacking, surveillance, unlawful intrusion, serious allegations, the kind that can bring down media empires. But those accusations only stand if the information was obtained illegally. And according to material now quietly circulating in legal and media circles, Harry knew, at the time, that at least some of the information didn't come from hacking at all. It came from inside the palace. A former aide, someone with access, someone who didn't need to spy because they were already in the room. That detail alone should stop you cold. Because blaming the press for a leak you privately know came from an internal source isn't a minor inconsistency, it's a narrative collapse. And this is exactly where Chelsy D steps back into the picture. Not as an ex, not as a relic, but as a problem. For years, Chelsy was treated like a footnote, the girlfriend who couldn't handle royal life, the one who walked away before things got serious. But that framing was convenient and wrong. Chelsy isn't a media chaser. She's legally trained, meticulous, famously private. She spent years avoiding attention while others monetized their pain. And crucially, she was in contact with Harry during the exact periods now under legal scrutiny. So ask yourself this, why would someone like that risk stepping anywhere near this mess now? Not for revenge, not for fame, and definitely not for nostalgia. It's discomfort. Discomfort watching a public narrative harden into fact when it doesn't match what she remembers or what she can prove. Discomfort watching blame get shoved outward while responsibility sat much closer to home. Discomfort realizing that silence, once neutral, was starting to look like complicity. Because silence is easy when stories stay messy. Silence is easy when truth is inconvenient. Silence is easy until someone raises their right hand in a courtroom and turns a partial story into official record. That's when silence becomes dangerous. And here's the part that should unsettle you the most. Chelsy didn't rush to the press, she didn't leak screenshots, she didn't do a tell-all interview, there was no dramatic reveal, no viral moment. The evidence just exists, messages, timestamps, call logs, quiet confirmations that line up with specific articles and specific moments, evidence that doesn't shout, evidence that waits. And waiting evidence is the most lethal kind, because when it surfaces, it doesn't argue, it contradicts. Harry's testimony leaned heavily on the idea that journalists must have crossed legal lines because private details appeared in print. That assumption feels intuitive, especially if you already distrust tabloids. But intuition isn't proof, and logic built on assumptions collapses fast under scrutiny. Because if Harry knew at the time that an internal source was responsible, even suspected it, then the courtroom story becomes something else entirely. Not a lie necessarily, but a curation, a narrowed version of events that emphasizes one villain and erases another, and courts are trained to notice that kind of narrowing. What makes this even more fragile is Harry's emotional emphasis on Meghan's suffering. Those tears froze the narrative, they made questioning feel cruel, but journalism doesn't stop at sympathy, and neither do judges. The real question isn't whether Harry feels wronged. The question is whether the story he told publicly matches what he acknowledged privately when the damage was unfolding. Because if he knew the press wasn't the original source, then the legal framing shifts dramatically. That doesn't erase harm, but it rewrites causation, and causation is everything. Now here's the twist no one wants to talk about. Internal leaks aren't cinematic. They're not dramatic. They don't come with villains you can sue. They're messy, quiet, and devastating. Naming an aide doesn't just expose a person, it exposes a system. It triggers investigations. It implicates institutions. It forces accountability where it's least welcome. Fighting tabloids is easier. And that's why this matters. Because if the harm originated inside, and Harry knew it, then blaming the press becomes not just convenient, but strategic. Not malicious. Human, but legally dangerous. Chelsy D exists in the timeline before the strategy, before the lawsuits, before the narrative solidified. She heard the confusion before certainty. She saw suspicion before blame found a permanent target. And that makes her perspective radioactive, because courts trust early truth more than polished memory. As this case unfolds, the official focus remains on whether journalists crossed legal lines. But beneath that is a question no one has dared ask out loud yet. What if the press didn't intrude, because the door was already open? And if Harry knew that, why didn't the court? This isn't about dismissing trauma. People can suffer and still misrepresent facts. Emotional truth can exist alongside factual omission. But once a story is told under oath, omission stops being personal. It becomes consequential. And the most dangerous evidence in this case may not come from reporters or editors at all. It may come from someone who stayed quiet for years and is now deciding whether quiet is still an option. Because if the story told in court doesn't fully match the story acknowledged in private, then what comes next won't just affect this lawsuit, it will change how everything before it is understood, and that reckoning hasn't landed yet. The moment you accept that the story might not have started with the press, everything else starts to wobble. Because once that door cracks open, just slightly, the entire case stops being about tabloids and starts being about choice. Who was blamed, who was protected, and who quietly absorbed the fallout while the narrative marched in another direction. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to sit with. Leaks don't happen in theory. They happen through people, real people, with access, with proximity, with conversations that never needed hacking because they were already inside the room. And in the earliest moments, before lawyers, before lawsuits, before Harry became a symbol in a larger media war, that reality was very much present. When the first deeply personal details appeared in print, the reaction behind the scenes wasn't outrage at journalists, it was confusion, then suspicion, then a slow, sinking realization that someone close had talked. That's not speculation. That's reflected in the private communications that now sit uncomfortably in the background of this case. Messages that don't sound like certainty. Messages that sound like someone trying to figure out how information escaped a controlled environment. Questions about access, about conversations, about who had been present. That kind of questioning doesn't happen when you think you've been hacked. It happens when you think you've been betrayed. And betrayal hits differently. Betrayal isn't loud. It's destabilizing. It forces you to look inward, at trust, at judgment, at systems you believed were safe. And that's where things get messy, because confronting internal betrayal doesn't just hurt emotionally. It creates consequences that ripple outward in ways people rarely anticipate. Naming an aide isn't like blaming a tabloid. You can't sue silence. You can't cross-examine whispers. You can't easily prove who said what in private corridors and off-record conversations. And even if you could, doing so would drag an entire institution into the light. Institutions hate that. So what happens instead is something very human. Blame drifts outward, complexity flattens, the story tightens until it fits into something that can be fought, named, and opposed. The press becomes the villain because the press is familiar, external, and already distrusted. And over time, that version becomes the version. The one repeated in interviews, the one reinforced by public sympathy, the one that eventually feels more real than the messy uncertainty that came before it, not because it's truer, but because it's easier to live with. This is where Harry's courtroom testimony becomes fragile, not because he was lying, but because he was telling a story that had evolved. A story that emphasized emotional truth while quietly sidelining factual complexity. And courts don't reward evolution. They reward consistency. Defense lawyers understand this better than anyone. They don't need to prove the press is innocent. They only need to show that the plaintiff's story isn't complete, that alternative explanations existed, and crucially, that the plaintiff knew about them at the time. That's why timing is everything here. Private messages sent before articles were published matter more than anything said years later. Call logs clustered around leak windows matter more than polished testimony, because those records capture awareness before strategy, confusion before certainty, thought before narrative, and the pattern they suggest is uncomfortable. They suggest that Harry didn't initially experience these leaks as proof of illegal press intrusion. He experienced them as a mystery, one that pointed inward before it ever pointed outward. That matters because legal claims aren't judged on how a story feels now. They're judged on what was known then. If Harry knew, or even suspected, that an internal source was responsible, continuing to frame the harm as the result of unlawful journalistic behavior alone becomes legally vulnerable. Not morally indefensible, but procedurally weak. And here's the irony that makes this case sting. Harry has spoken endlessly about the danger of distorted narratives, about misinformation, about the harm caused when stories are simplified for impact. Yet this case may hinge on a story that did exactly that. Simplified, focused, clean, too clean. Because once internal leaks are acknowledged, the press stops being the origin of harm and becomes the amplifier. And amplification, while damaging, doesn't carry the same legal weight as unlawful acquisition. That's why the unnamed aid matters so much. Not because they're famous, not because they're dramatic, but because their existence changes the genre of this story. It stops being a media expose and becomes an internal reckoning. And internal reckonings are the most dangerous kind, because they don't end with a verdict. They spread. They raise questions no one wants to answer. Who failed? Who knew? Who chose not to act? And why? This is where Chelsy D's role becomes unavoidable. She wasn't part of palace machinery. She wasn't managing optics. She wasn't shaping strategy. She was there when the confusion was still raw, before the narrative hardened. She heard the uncertainty in real time. She saw suspicion form before blame found a permanent home. And she stayed silent. For years. That silence wasn't accidental. It was restraint. A refusal to insert herself into a story that was already being told too loudly. But silence has limits. And those limits are reached when omission starts to look like distortion. The moment Harry stood in court and presented a world where the press was the primary, almost exclusive source of the leaks, that line was crossed. Because that wasn't the story she remembered. And more importantly, it wasn't the story the records support. Courts don't care about nostalgia. They care about timelines. And timelines don't bend for emotion. This is where the danger truly lies for Harry. Not in any single message, not in any one-call log, but in convergence, patterns, the quiet alignment of records that tell a story without ever raising their voice. Because once the court starts asking why certain evidence wasn't presented, the focus shifts fast. It stops being about whether journalists behaved badly and becomes about whether the full picture was ever offered. And that question doesn't just threaten this case, it threatens credibility. Because reform movements depend on precision, on the ability to say exactly what happened and how. When stories blur, even for understandable reasons, they weaken the cause they're meant to serve. This isn't about tearing Harry down, it's about confronting the possibility that emotional truth overtook factual completeness. That pain shaped the narrative more than evidence, and that strategy quietly replaced inquiry. The law is unforgiving about that. Judges don't ask whether a story feels right, they ask whether it survives contact with records. And records don't forget, they don't evolve, they don't adapt to purpose, they just sit there, waiting to be noticed. As this trial continues, pressure will mount, not from headlines, but from what hasn't been addressed. From the unanswered question hovering over everything. If the internal leak explanation existed from the start, why wasn't it central? And once that question is asked, it doesn't stop. Because acknowledging it opens doors no one has wanted to open. Doors into palace culture, into information control, into accountability failures that extend far beyond one man and one lawsuit. That's the real risk here. Not losing the case, but losing control of the story. Because once the narrative stops being about the press and starts being about choice, everything changes. Sympathy fractures, certainty dissolves, and the emotional shield that once protected the testimony becomes a liability. The reckoning hasn't arrived yet, but it's close. And when it does, it won't come from a tabloid headline or a viral clip. It will come from something far quieter. A date, a message, a call placed at the wrong time. And once that happens, the question won't be whether Harry was hurt. The question will be whether the court was ever told the whole story.